Great. Hi, everyone. Today we have a very special guest. We have William Green, who wrote this wonderful book, Richer, Wiser, and Happier. If this is your first time tuning in and you're doing something else, stop what you're doing and get this book. It is that good, especially if you want to learn about not only investing, but life in general. So today, very lucky to have William Green, author of this wonderful book. And he also played a key role in another book that was pivotal in my life, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But William, why don't you share a little bit about your personal story, so that way if folks that are tuning in for the first time, hearing about your book for the first time, can sort of know how sort of fortunate and lucky. I mean, it's just incredible how you were able to learn from investors that have incredible track records, have lived for and invested for decades, and a lot of them aren't even around anymore. So you get to share the wisdom that you got to experience from them firsthand that folks can't get anymore. So please
Sure,
share.
absolutely. No, thank you. First of all, I have to say I like seeing the copy of your book, which looks really beaten up. It's like either you've read it really thoroughly, or you've actually just sort of scraped it against the sidewalk to make it look like it. But that's a good sized divot on the top of the. So right. Thank you. I'm someone who beats up my books. I read them hard and I note on every page. So I'm glad to see a thoroughly thumbed copy of that. Thank you. So yeah, my background is I really am the least likely person to be talking to you about investing at all, because and I always feel like people are about to discover just how little I actually know about economics, business, accounting, all of these things. I was an English literature student at Oxford, and I came out of Oxford thinking, I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write great fiction. Everyone's going to revere me for the beauty of my prose. And then I sort of stumbled into writing about the stock market in my, I guess, around my mid-20s, 26, that sort of thing. And the reason was partly that my brother and I sold an apartment that we owned together in London. And it wasn't this huge windfall, but it was enough of a windfall that I actually had to figure out what to do with the money. And so I started reading about the stock market and discovered that it was just kind of breathtakingly interesting. And I think part of the reason why I found it so interesting initially was just that I liked the idea of making money without doing very hard work. And I just thought, this is amazing. I don't need to sort of stack shelves or mow lawns or put up with a really irritating boss. You can actually just kind of make a bet and it goes up. This was sort of my youthful fantasy of it, which turned out to be somewhat true and somewhat untrue. But I had this unusual opportunity because as a journalist, I actually could go interview these extraordinary people. So I started off, I would do things like I had an investment in Marty Whitman's Third Avenue Value Fund. And I actually went off and interviewed him in New York multiple times. And he was kind of this crotchety old guy wearing shorts and a tennis shirt who basically just sort of would talk about how stupid most other investors were. And he was wonderfully articulate and funny. And then I went off to the Bahamas to spend a day with Sir John Templeton, who was probably the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century. And I would do things like I wrote a story for Fortune right after 9/11, where I went off for a couple of days with Bill Miller on around September 23rd, 24th, as the market was just imploding. And Miller at the time was the most successful mutual fund manager of his generation, who was in the midst of this streak where he was beating the market for 15 years running, which is totally unprecedented and probably will never be repeated. And I would write about him as the market's melting down and he's just calmly betting hundreds of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And so I just got to see these extraordinary things. And so in some strange way, I had started off as a storyteller, just wanting to tell stories about interesting people. And then I discovered the stock market and I kind of put these two things together. And I think these guys like Templeton and Bill Miller and Marty Whitman and Peter Lynch and all these other people, Jack Bogle that I got to interview, were just strange and interesting and colorful and opinionated, brilliant people. And so in a way, what's happened to me is that over the last 25 years, I've just got to interview more and more of these extraordinary people. And then I the ones who were most interesting, I would go back and interview again and again. So someone like Bill Miller, who I spoke to earlier in the week, I've probably interviewed him for 90 hours, something like that, over the last 20 years. And so I've sort of seen his tremendous ups, his tremendous down, and now his tremendous up again. And it's kind of wonderful. And so for a storyteller, this has become an amazing niche to write about. And what I've ended up trying to do with this book in particular is to say, okay, so when I look back on the last 25 years, what have I actually learned? What are the things that you need to distill and internalize from the greatest investors? Not just about how to get rich, but actually about how to think better and more counterintuitively, actually how to live more wisely, because these are some of the smartest, most thoughtful people on earth. And so that's really the mad, over-ambitious goal of this book is kind of to share everything that I'd figured out over the last 25 years. And I think in some ways, the stakes kept going up as I worked on the book, partly in the end, perhaps because of COVID. I was finishing it then, but I just kept thinking, well, the world is an uncertain place. I don't know if I'm going to survive. Let me at least write one thing that's worthwhile, that might survive the test of time, and we'll see if it does. But at least that was the goal, was actually to try to share some things that my kids would find helpful, that other people would find helpful, and that would kind of help me as well, because it forced me to sort of think through what I actually believe and have learned.
Yeah, there's certainly, I think you hit it out of the park, and you really tap into a lot of these sort of timeless traits, and sort of, helps folks understand not only about the individuals and how eccentric they are, but also the individual habits that they built over time. And we'll talk about whether or not that's innate or developed a little bit later on. But a lot of folks, I want to, originally I was tempted to say, hey, let's talk about, how do you, get richer? How do you get, wiser? How do you get happier? And the reality is, these character traits really cover all three. If you get one, it might be hitting, 777 on a slot machine equivalent, where all of a sudden you're really lucking out. And so I'm curious, we'll talk about those traits in a second. But for a lot of folks that are relatively new to the market, and I think you've seen that over the last year or two, for example, Robinhood has become very popular and brought in millions of new, investors to the market. And even if you're not super new, even if you've been around for 5 to 10 years or longer, the reality is you're tapping into investors, their respective journeys that have gone on for decades, seeing, over a century of data. And so what would be your quick, take or advice to share with those folks that are relatively new to the market, to say, hey, these are the things that you should consider, just to sort of get your bearings, for something to consider for your own journey?
I think if you're relatively new, but even if you're more experienced, one of the things that I wish I had known much earlier in my investment career is just how important it is to get the big things right. That we spend so much time worrying about all these minutiae. And in fact, this goes for most areas in life. Sorry, I have an extremely creaky chair that I forgot to replace, so I'm sitting here. I once was interviewing Bill Miller, and he's sitting in a rocking chair, and it's just squeaking the whole way through. And I was like, God, this recording is going to work out like crap. No, I've committed the same sin, so I'm sorry.
Hardly.
Yeah, if you get the big things right, so think of what the big things are. If you really take advantage of things like tax advantaged vehicles like 401ks, IRAs, 529 plans, that's a huge advantage, because taxes take an enormous bite out of your profits.
Yeah.
If you live within your means and you keep investing the excess and you just keep adding to the pot, if every time the market gets hit, at the very least you don't sell, but ideally you add to it, so you're not knocked out of the game by volatility. You don't overreach, so you're not betting borrowed money, for example, which means that you're unlikely to be rational, you're unlikely to survive, you're going to get knocked out of the game by catastrophe. If you just avoid some of the standard stupidities, as Charlie Munger would say, like the overreaching, like the believing in market predictions, for example, and you just kind of stick to your knitting of living within your means and adding to the pot consistently, the power of long-term compounding is so extraordinary that you actually don't really need to do anything that complicated. And I think what happened to me along the way, when I look back at my biggest mistakes, it was almost invariably when I got jealous of the things that other people were doing that were making them incredibly rich, or something appealed to my ego. So, for example, I got caught out at least twice and possibly more investing in private companies run by people very much on the inside, like really smart, rich, successful people. Goldman Sachs was investing at a higher valuation than me, and I thought, God, I'm like in the know. I've got access. I'm so smart, and so it really appealed to my prejudices and my ego and my need to be, my particular set of vulnerabilities and flaws, and invariably those things turned out terribly. And if I had just stuck to the simple stuff, like buying very long-term investments, not trying to do anything too crazy, which I did as well. I mean, that's but that stuff worked out incredibly well. The things where, for example, I invested, for example, in my friend Guy Spears' hedge fund, Aquamarine, which has been very solidly good over 20 years, for a little more than that, but I've invested in it for probably 21 years. And Guy, who has a much better temperament for investing than I do, just never sold Berkshire Hathaway. So, for example, in 1999, 2000, when everyone was saying that Buffett was an idiot and that he'd lost his touch, and Berkshire was selling for, I don't know, was it something like $40,000 a share? Guy put something like a quarter of his fund in Berkshire. And has held it for all these years. I would never have had the patience to do that. But because I don't want to let down Guy, because he's a dear friend and I don't want to betray our friendship, I've held on to his fund for all these years. It would take a lot for me to want to sell it, because I would feel like it was such a betrayal of our friendship. And so I've actually used that quirk in my character to keep me patient. So these simple things, like actually investing very patiently for a long time, and not doing anything stupid like trading in and out of the market, panicking, or failing to take advantage of your 401k or your IRA. It sounds so basic, but I think it gets at a really profoundly important truth, which is most of the really valuable stuff in life is really pretty simple. Like if you just exercise, right? Like you don't need to be the greatest athlete. But if you basically, I mean, I think, I'm no expert on this, as you can see from my physique, but but there's a reason why my camera is pointed upwards and not downwards at my belly. But if you just exercise, whatever, 150 to 200 minutes a week, and some of it is in a vigorous zone, and the rest of it is kind of moderate, you're going to be, you've covered most of what you need to do in terms of exercise. Like if you did more, great. If you did yoga and, weights and stuff, great. That's got all its benefits. There are always ways to be better, but it's like you get a lot of the benefit by doing that. And I think it's the same if you're reading constantly, if you're working hard, if you're trying to be kind to your wife and kids or whatever. The basic activities that get you most of the way are actually pretty simple. And then there's a difference if you want to be extraordinary. I think if you want to be in the top kind of 1% or 0.01% in anything, then it's a different game.
And in terms of, and I think that's separated out in this book as well, where you're sort of saying this 1%, this top 0.1%, these are the things that they're doing separately. And I think, like what, for example, one character trait that I think you see over and over again with that 0.1% is this focus on longevity. And you had this great conversation or quote with Jeff Gundlach, where he said, "Make your mistakes non-fatal." It's so fundamental to longevity, and ultimately that's what success in this business is. It's the longevity. I just absolutely love that, especially because that's the theme you see over and over again. You see Warren Buffett, multi-decade career, Charlie Munger, Irving Kahn, Arnold Vandenberg. So, I'd love to hear, do you have any other sort of thoughts in terms of that 0.1% that really, that separates them from the rest?
Well, I mean, just first to talk a bit about that that idea of resilience, that strikes me as hugely important. And I sometimes wonder if we get so caught up, partly in the media, but partly, I guess, just the financial industry, in focusing on the horse race over short periods, saying, this guy's beaten the market over the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, that sort of thing. So there's so much focus on the horse race, which is really important if you're marketing a fund, right? You want to say, well, I beat the market by 3 percentage points a year, and that's great. That's great. That serves their business interest to be able to tout that. But for most of us, I think we should spend way more time focusing on resilience. And so one of the things that I became fascinated by, I ended up writing a chapter called The Resilient Investor. And in a sense, it's my play on the intelligent investor. And what I'm trying to say is nothing matters more than survival. And when you look at these people like Irving Kahn, who, I interviewed at the age of 108, right? I mean, a few months before he died at the age of 109. Here's this guy who lived through, he started investing, I think, in 1928, right before the crash of 29, survived World War II, the Great Depression, all of these crises, meltdowns. It's not really about maximizing. It's about actually surviving those periods. And I remember his son, who now is head of Kahn Brothers, the family firm, saying to me, my dad had kind of a ridiculous amount of cash in his portfolio, and he could have maximized by having less cash. But he said the fact that he lived within his means and he had all this cash meant that he didn't have to worry too much. And so he said that during these really difficult periods where other people were kind of hanging from the ledge, he said, my father was like, well, I'm uncomfortable, but I can still eat, hamburgers, which is all he really wanted to eat. He didn't really care about, going to fancy French restaurants and the like. And so in some ways, I was thinking through this problem myself, and I was thinking, well, do I really care if I beat the market? Or is it more relevant to me, actually, whether I get to the destination safely and soundly? And my destination probably is to be securely and independently wealthy, so I don't have to work for an asshole, basically. That's kind of hugely important to me, given, excuse my language, but given the quirks of my temperament. I don't want to work for people I don't like. I don't want to do work that I don't enjoy. I don't want to have to worry about paying for bills, things like that. So for me, it would be satisfying for my ego to beat the market. And I hope that I do beat the market. And it gives me pleasure when I own a fund that does beat the market. But it's not the most important thing. And there was something Matthew McLennan, who I wrote about in that chapter, The Resilient Investor, said to me that had a big impact on me. But he said, you really have to focus on the destination. He has this wonderful quote from Seneca where he talks about just needing to know where you're sailing to. And I think for all of us, it's worth asking that question. For you in your position, you have to find some great stocks, right? Some 100 baggers, some 10 baggers. I mean, you're playing a different game. For me, I don't think it really matters if I beat the market at all. I want to become securely wealthy. And so someone was asking me last week about Berkshire Hathaway, and I've owned Berkshire Hathaway for quite a while, not nearly as long as I wish I had. And I don't really care whether it does incredibly well or not, and whether he's sitting on too much cash or not. He's going to survive. He's positioned himself, as Guy Spear would say, to be the last man standing. And so if there's tremendous chaos in the economy, you know that Buffett's going to be okay, that he's going to be able to take advantage of it. And you know that he's set it up to survive everything. So to me, the avoidance of catastrophe and the ability to survive and to make it to your destination seems inordinately important. And I think if there's I'm not sure that I'm right about this, because I think it depends on what the game is you're playing. But I think you have to, for your listeners, if there's a takeaway, I think it's to really sit down and ask yourself. So I'm just looking outside my window. There's literally a cat chasing a deer outside my window. That was quite an eye-catching sight. I think you have to sit down. You have to really ask yourself, what's the game I'm playing? What's the destination I'm trying to reach? And it's kind of like when Buffett said you don't want to use leverage if you're already rich, because it would be like marrying for money when you're already rich. Like it's just pointless.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to really ask yourself honestly, what's the game I'm playing? And so for the kind of investors I'm writing about in the book, this is a tiny percentage of ultimate game players, right? These are kind of the titans of the game, and it's still really hard for them. And so what I'm trying to do is say, well, if you think you're equipped to win this game, if you have the temperament, the skills, the knowledge, the wiring, here's how you play it, or at least here are a lot of ways to play it that have worked. But one of the revelations for me is I'm not really equipped to win this game. And it's kind of a sad realization. I'd much rather be able to sort of make out that I'm a genius at this stuff. But it's pretty helpful to recognize my limitations.
I really love that answer because it's actually feeds into this other aspect, which is I loved Richer, Wiser, and Happier. I highly recommend folks stop what they're doing and get it. But you also played a key role in this book as well, which you already mentioned. Guy Spear, his hedge fund, you're an investor in it, where he wrote this book, The Education of a Value Investor. And what that book was really, like personally like touched me, because up until then, I was always thinking, well, what would Warren Buffett do? Like in college, I had a poster of Warren Buffett like above my bed, and I was like thinking about that. And reading that book,
I was like the teenager with the poster of Bo Derek, and you had Warren Buffett. This shows how much more evolved you were than I was.
Like, well, not more involved, just exposure. I'd like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett. It was real hit with all the ladies that you see.
Yeah.
As you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so what I loved with that, and you see it here too, is that it's about exploring sort of your personal journey and making sure that who you are aligns with that journey that you're on. Because if you're swinging for, let's say, the 10 or 100 baggers, or that's your mission, but the reality is you don't care. You just want to be safe. You want to be that resilient investor. Like you have a fundamental mismatch. So you need to think about, well, wait a second, who am I? And that's a core aspect that I loved about both of these books, is that what seems so interesting is you're finding all these different investors that took very different journeys because it ultimately aligned, with their value system. Bill Miller seeing tremendous drawdown in financials and having Amazon be like one of his largest positions in Bitcoin. Like that's something that a lot of other investors, where they'd say this just doesn't align with who I am. So yeah,
it's a very profound point, and I've thought about this a great deal. This idea of I was actually thinking about it right before this conversation. Was writing a note to myself about the importance of being internally aligned. And it's one of those things, right? I think you could push this idea as far as you want, and it just is hugely important. The idea of internal alignment, of being truly aligned with the way you invest, with the way you live your life. I think there's tremendous power to that. And I think part of Guy's story is that he realized during the financial crisis that he was misaligned, and he got kind of swept up in what he called in that book this kind of New York vortex, where I think he had been at Harvard Business School with people like Bill Ackman, and he saw how much richer Bill had got than him. And he'd been at Oxford in the same tutorial as David Cameron, who became prime minister. And Cameron got a first in economics, or PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. Guy got this George Webb medal for coming top of his year in economics. I mean, Guy's a really bright boy. And so I think it kind of killed him for a while, that he was like, and wait, I'm just managing this relatively small fund. And so I remember having this conversation with him many years ago, where I think he was starting to explore marketing the fund more. And I'm like, why bother? I was sitting with him at this lunch in New York. I mean, I don't know, this must be 15 or so years ago. And I was saying, half the money in the fund is your family's money. You have this tremendous advantage where you don't really need to market if you just kind of get control over your ego and you just kind of keep compounding. It's an amazing position to be in. But I think he found being in New York surrounded by all of these pressures, these people who wanted to take his really good record and say, no, I can raise assets for you. He got kind of caught up in that vortex. And I think when the financial crisis hit, he just sort of said, no, I'm not playing that game anymore. And he moved to this relatively quiet area of Zurich, where he's got a really nice office in a really quiet building, and he can just think quietly. And he's got a really beautiful mind, but like mine, he's got a much better mind than mine. But like mine is very distractible, as you can see from the fact that I suddenly notice a cat, and I'm like, ooh. And I think being in a quiet neighborhood that some people would find boring, it's very attractive, but some people would find it boring. He explained to me that it enables him to have a mind that's like a quiet pond, so he can actually see the ripples in it. And I think because Guy had done so much work on himself and he's very self-aware, he was able to reboot his life in a way that's extremely true to who he is. And that was a powerful model to me. And I think also because that period of the financial crisis was a very difficult period for me, because I lost my job where I was an editor of the international editions of Time at that point, and of the European, Middle East, and African edition. I got laid off. And then at the same time, my stock portfolio is crashing. And I'm sort of seeing my industry fall apart, the journalism world falling apart. I sort of felt really misaligned myself. I'm like, I'm untethered. And I'm like, what do I do? Where should I live? I was living in London at the time, but my wife's a New Yorker and my kids were born in New York, but we lived in Hong Kong because I edited the Asian edition of Time. Then we moved to London. So I'm like, where do I live? What do I do when my professions collapse? So for me, there was this kind of untethered period where I think the fact that I could see Guy rebooting his life, having rebooted his life, it made me think, okay, so how do I live in a way that's true to me? And so part of what I ended up doing is I moved back to New York, and I eventually, initially I lived in my in-laws' basement, next to their washing machine and dryer. And I'm like, wow, here I am in my 40s as a, previously very successful journalist and editor. And I'm living next to the it's a very beautiful house. I'm not knocking it or asking for sympathy. But then we found a house, and we've sort of gradually built our lives in a way that I feel is much truer to who I am and to what I want to do. And I'm sorry if that all sounds sort of very self-referential, but actually I think it's a very profoundly important process, and critically important. Yeah, and for both Guy and me, I think we were forced to do it when things went wrong. And so sometimes when there's a kind of major crisis in your life, whether it's your fun getting the crap kicked out of it, or losing your job, or a health issue, or losing a relative, or all of these things, God forbid, that can happen, I think whether you believe it's for a purpose or not, I'm somewhat mystical, so I'm inclined to believe that these things happen to you for a reason. Whether that's true or not, I think it's incredibly helpful either to have that belief or to have that delusion, and to say, okay, this is happening for a reason. Let me use this to realign myself, to make sure that I'm living in a way, working in a way that's true to myself. And I have this feeling that when you're misaligned, as an investor, it comes up and bites you in the butt in some way. So if you own stuff that doesn't suit your temperament or your risk tolerance or your ethics, or you're behaving in a way that's unethical, I think if you're a fundamentally ethical person, if you're a sociopath, it's different. But if you're a fundamentally ethical person, you're behaving in a way that you're ashamed of, or you have to suppress your shame, for example, there's a misalignment that I think gets you in the end. And there's something about the market. It's such a brutal force that I think sooner or later it exposes those fault lines in your personality. And so I think it's quite important to look at yourself and try to figure out, well, am I investing in a way that's true to who I am? Am I living in a way that's true to who I am? And we're all knocked off course intermittently, but at least knowing that it's important is key. And I think one of the debates that I've often had, so it's a very long-winded answer, but I think it's an important subject.
It's
One of the debates I've often had is when you're very rich, like when you're like these people that I'm writing about, I think they have a tremendous freedom to live in a way that's in alignment with who they are.
yeah.
Said to me at one point, we're in his beautiful house in Maryland, and he's like, I didn't decorate the house, my sister decorated the house, and he loves his dog. He's not even really his sister's like taking care of his dog. He's like, he doesn't pump gas in his car ever. He hadn't flown on a commercial flight for like 20 years, even though he'd made this massively successful bet on commercial airlines. It was years since he'd been on a commercial airline, and so his money had enabled him to get rid of all of the stuff that he didn't like to do in life, so that really he could just focus on the things that he's best at and most interested in, which are reading, thinking, making bets on the market, outthinking the crowd, and adding value each month for his investors. And so I often thought, I think I had this kind of element of envy, where I was like, well, here I am. I'm in this shitty industry that's falling apart, and it's I got 2 kids in private school and now in college, or one is now graduated, and it's like, so I have all of these pressures. How can I live in a way that's truly aligned with who I am? And so it comes back a little bit to this quote from Ben Franklin that Buffett and Munger often quote, which is, "The empty sack can't stand straight." And so I think it's difficult when you're in a time in your life where you feel really stressed and you have no sense of abundance, or you feel a sense of lack. It's much harder to be benevolent, philanthropic, aligned with who you are. It's a challenge. I'll give you that. And I've thought about this, but just the fact that I've seen the advantages of living in alignment with yourself, albeit in a group of people who are very wealthy, that's been very clarifying for me, because it's made me realize that, for example, when something comes along, when a project comes along that's like just lucrative, but it doesn't suit me, to be able to say, yeah, maybe not, and or to go do something that maybe will appeal to your ego, but it's like, yeah, it's kind of a violation of who I am. No, I'm not doing that. And so this is, there's a lovely line in the book where Tom Gaynor talks about being directionally correct. We don't have to be optimal in all of these things, but for me, just to know that I want to become much more aligned with my quirky nature, my interests, my passions, my talents, that's been hugely clarifying. And I do think when I see people like Guy or Monish Pabrai, Joe Greenblatt, Bill Miller, Tom Gaynor, Arnold Vandenberg, all Charlie Munger, all of these people that I've focused on in the book, they're very aligned with who they are sometimes in a really antisocial way. I loved the fact that Monish said to me, I'm just not interested in all of the mumbo jumbo of meeting with people and trying to market my fund. I'm just not going to do it. And I love the fact that he is perfectly happy to forego millions and millions of dollars a year in fees, because he just doesn't want to do it. That to me, there's something really lovely about that. And I write about this in the book, where he said, after a lunch with someone, I'll just say, did I enjoy that lunch? And he said, if I didn't enjoy that lunch, there will never be another lunch with that person. And I remember after this saying to Monish, I'm glad that you're having to still have a few meals with me. And he was like, yeah, I'm okay with you with it. But there's something kind of really antisocial about that, and also really powerful. Like he would just, one of his filters is just to say, when I meet someone, is this person going to make me better or worse? And so just to know himself that well, and to have his values that deeply ingrained, and to know that he wants to be aligned with who he is, I think is a very powerful thing. And for Monish, one of the things that happened to him is that he ran this successful tech consulting firm. And when he got these guys in to do a sort of psychological analysis of him, they were like, this is absolutely ridiculous. Why are you running this business where you're like supposed to be inspiring and leading the people who you're in charge of? And he's like, yeah, I just didn't give a shit about all these people, these weeping and crying, like, nah. And so for Monish, just discovering, no, I need to sit quietly in a room and read and occasionally find a mispriced gamble.
Yeah.
That's the game he's wired for.
And that feeds into this other question. So, you mentioned, a lot of these folks, they're there and they've figured it out. Now, there's a lot of younger folks, myself included, where you sort of say, well, wait a second, how do I make sure I'm aligned? How do I figure out those values? And I think you even shared a bit about your own personal journey. You talking about how when you met with Templeton, he was talking about spirituality, and you were sort of like, do people think of you as a kook? And sort of rubbed in the wrong way. And then years later, you're like, wow, he was so right. I wish I hadn't rolled my eyes. So I guess the question is, and perhaps this reflects the naivete of youth, is there a way to sort of accelerate that process to at least be aware of your own values, to see if you're aligned? So like you mentioned Monish Pabrai, doing that test to sort of, where outside folks would say, hey, here's actually your core value system. Are there other sort of either data points? Because I think a lot of folks are sort of saying, well, wait a second, I don't know if I'm like, they don't even, there isn't even that level of awareness to say, hey, this isn't right, or this is not aligned.
Yeah, it's an incredible question. I think part of what happens is that you tend not to really make a major shift in your life until you realize just how badly you got it wrong. And so there's something about these crises, like if a girl breaks up with you who you loved, or walks away from the altar, and you're like, oh my God, or you lose a parent, or God forbid, a child, or something like that, or a job, or your health. There's something about these crises that forces you, I think, to say, all right, I'm way off track. But I think the trick, so the first trick is just when something really serious is happening, whether it's a pandemic or a personal crisis like a job loss, or a problem with a relationship or your health or something. I think the first thing is don't waste those things. I mean, I used to say sort of facetiously to my kids when I started to exercise really seriously during the pandemic, because at the start I was like, well, I don't have control over variance and all of these things, but I do have control over the fact that I'm heavy and sedentary. And so let me get a Peloton. And so I've done probably, 650 rides since then. And so that I have control over. So I used to say to them, we better not waste a good pandemic. And there's something facetious and kind of appalling about saying that. But when you have something really serious happen like that, don't waste it. Make sure you use it really to say, what's out of whack in my life that I need to rebuild on a stronger foundation. But there's a tool that Nick Sleep talked about with me that I think is really profoundly helpful, that may also help, where he talks about destination analysis, which was a technique that he used in analyzing companies, but it also relates to every area of life, where Nick would say, everyone's so focused on the short term, right? They're looking at, how's this company going to do over the next 12 weeks, or is it going to beat its earnings estimates for next year? And he and his partner, Zach, were just not interested in that stuff. They were tuning out all of the short-term noise, what he called wiggle guessing. And he said, I'm looking at these much longer term questions with a longer shelf life, as he would put it. So he would say, what's a desirable destination here for this business? And what are the inputs that are going to get it to that destination? And so, for example, is a company like Amazon or Costco treating its customers in a way that's going to get it to this destination, or are they violating their customers' trust? Are they squeezing suppliers too much, or are they treating them okay? Are they, all of these things, are they getting to act in a way that gets them to the destination? Another, if you wanted to apply that to your own life, instead of waiting for a crisis to happen where things go wrong and you realize, God, I'm so misaligned and I'm so wrong in the way that I've done it, I would say, look at a desirable destination in your life. Say, okay, so what do I actually want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What do I want how do I want to talk? How do I want my family, my kids, my friends to talk about me at my funeral? Do I want people to look back on me in this way or in this way? And then say, given that desirable destination, what are the inputs to get there? And am I off track? And I think there's something really clarifying about that kind of self-inquiry. So maybe that's a way of kind of forcing your mind to think about things that you might not otherwise think about until there's a crisis and you realize how badly off track you were. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer, which is, the way my takeaway from it is you either, if you're either lazy and wait for a crisis to sort of slap you on the face, or B, you sort of say, hey, what's this destination? What's the destination? Where am I looking to go? And if you answer, what do I look like 10 years from now? Trying to do some sort of thought experiment. Then you sort of work backwards from there.
Yeah, and I think you can choose any time period. So you can say with your career, okay, where do I want to be in 5 years?
Yeah.
But I think there's something about saying, how do I want to be remembered? I mean, there are a couple of people I write about. There's a thing. One of the strangest sections of the book is the notes on sources and additional resources, because no one was really checking, so I could kind of write whatever I wanted. And so there's a bit where so I throw in things that you wouldn't usually expect. And there's a bit where I talk about Jack Bogle, and I tell this story where I was interviewing him 20-something years ago, actually over the phone. This is, the legendary founder of the Vanguard Group, which now manages, $7 trillion. And I was talking to him about his mentor, who is this guy, Walter Morgan, who gave him his first job, basically, and he was his role model. And Walter Morgan was one of the pioneers of the mutual fund industry. And this is this very, very honorable, decent guy. And as I'm talking to Bogle, the phone goes dead. And I'm like, oh my God, I remember I was sitting in the Time Life building. I remember myself on the phone and I'm like, oh God, here I am doing this interview. I lost contact with this legendary guy. And I'm like, Mr. Bogle, are you still there? And after a few seconds, he says, I'm sorry, this is putting tears in my eyes. And I said, really, really stupidly, I was just like, how do you reply to that? I'm like, how come? And he says, because I realized how kind he was and how much I loved him. And so here's this guy whose Bogle now is dead. I think he died in 2019. His mentor is long dead. And yet when I asked him about what Walter Morgan had done that influenced him so much, the answer really clarifies this question, what sort of person you want to become, what kind of destination you want to get to. Because he says to me, one of the things that I learned from Mr. Morgan, he always called him Mr. Morgan, was that the shareholder is king. And he said, by God, one of his shareholders wrote to him and said, I don't have a suit. And Mr. Morgan sent him a suit of his own. And so if you think about that, here we are all these years later, and Vanguard, in a sense, is infused with that mindset of taking care of its shareholders. And that mindset is a reflection of Jack Bogle's personality and his integrity, which is also a reflection of what he learned from Walter Morgan. And so part of what I was trying to do in the book was also preserve these extraordinary things where you learn from someone who's maybe no longer around, whether it's a Templeton or an Irving Kahn or a Jack Bogle or a Walter Morgan, and you're preserving the wisdom that they had. And there's a wonderful book by a British biographer called Richard Holmes that I read many years ago, where he talks about handshakes through history. Part of what the biography process is these handshakes through history, where you're sort of you're immersing yourself in the life of someone who's dead and trying to capture their wisdom. And for me, there's something very moving about that idea that that Bogle was still so influenced and so moved by this old guy. And so if you think about, there's sometimes when when a Jewish person dies, people will say, may his memory be a blessing. And I really thought about that when I was writing about Walter Morgan and Jack Bogle. I'm like, may his memory be a blessing, and that's a pretty good destination, right? I mean, we're all going to die, but how, what sort of person do you want to be? And so I think this question of destination analysis, it informs everything that we do. If you really think about it deeply, it informs what sort of career do you want, what sort of behavior do you want. And I'm not trying to be pious or self-righteous about this at all, because I screw up the whole time. And if you saw me sort of shouting at my dog when she's barking incessantly at cars outside, or at deer, or at squirrels, you'd be like, wow, really? I'm taking advice from this. But at least to know that that's the direction in which we want to go, that's very helpful to me.
I love that. So, you touched a little bit about handling adversity in that last answer. And that was actually a question that came from one of my Unrivaled Investing Journey subscribers, because I said, hey, we're really lucky, we're going to have William Green and, ask some questions. So throw it out there. So Fred, he was asking me if there's effectively any habits, hacks, or tricks that have helped folks overcome the adversity, because it's one thing to read, that, Charlie, or hear Charlie Munger, say, hey, I'm a survivor, not a victim. And it's one thing to see and read about Templeton and losing his wife and sort of saying, and having these maybe aphorisms or sayings where he goes, thank goodness for these blessings that come to me, and saying things like that. So I'm curious, what are those, mental hacks or tricks that folks should consider, because that acceptance of adversity, that acceptance of challenge, that seems like another one of those overarching themes where you're not taking one tragedy, one adversity, and multiplying it, which is a common, that's a common element that you see. And here it is, that I'd argue is one of the keys. That's that 777 on the slot machine, where it's, happier, wiser, richer, when you consider all those things. It's handling that adversity. So I'm curious on the hacks.
And I think one reason why the theme of resilience and equanimity is such a central one in the book is precisely because I had gone through that period after the financial crisis where it felt a little bit like my life was falling apart. And so when I was going to interview people like Bill Miller, this was a really central theme, right? Because I could see for someone like Bill, during the financial crisis, I mean, I'd interviewed him as far back as 1999, 2000. So I'd seen him at the absolute pinnacle. Then I interviewed him through the years, and then I interviewed him right after the financial crisis, and he'd just been smashed, right? He was telling me how more than 100 people had lost their jobs because of a mistake that he'd made, an analytical mistake, and he lost all of this money for his shareholders. And he said, look, losing money for myself, I'm okay with that. I don't really care. He's like, I'm the son of a taxi driver. I grew up with nothing. I'm okay if I don't have money. I know I'll be okay. But losing money for shareholders and having people lose their jobs because of me, that was traumatic. And so because I'd gone through a difficult period myself, and was still going through it, that was very much a central part of what I was talking to people like Bill about, was, so how do you deal with it? And one of the things that was really helpful and clarifying for me was Bill's discussion of Stoic philosophy, which had a huge impact on him and the way that he handled the financial crisis. It's funny, I was just thinking, because I talked to him the other day, and we were doing a strange event, a wonderful event where he was interviewing me and I was interviewing him. He said, when did you become so interested in things like Stoic philosophy? And I'm like, because of you. It's like all of these things, they all came from him. And but one of the central lessons that Bill taught me that had helped him tremendously from the Stoics, these are people like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, all of whom are fantastic, was that you need to distinguish between what you can control and what you can't control. And so he said, I can't control my reputation. I can't control what people are going to say about me. And he said, he showed me at the time something on Twitter where he's like, look at this guy. There was something where Bill had like hit the ball out of the park unbelievably with his fund, and his returns were amazing. And this guy wrote something dismissive about, Bill's returns. And he was like, that asshat Bill Miller is just going to lose. And he's like, really? Asshat? This guy I've never met is and so he said, he's like, I can't control that sort of thing, but I can control trying to behave honorably. I can control trying to get money back that I've lost for my shareholders. I can control being honest about my mistakes. I can learn from my mistakes. So he became more diversified because he said, I didn't realize how catastrophically wrong I could be. And once I realized that, I became more diversified after that. And I thought there was great nobility in the way that he handled adversity. And so when I told Bill's story in the book, it's really, there's something kind of triumphant about it, about the way he's rebuilt his life in a way that's profoundly aligned to who he is. And I don't know, I said in the book there are two great lessons for me from his story. And one of them is simply everyone suffers. We all suffer. And it sounds like such a trite and simplistic truth. But that for me has been very reassuring, is to think, okay, so when I'm going through a difficult period, or I'm just depressed or feeling melancholy or feeling like I'm going the wrong direction, just to know, okay, this is part of the human condition. Just as the Buddhist philosophy, they talk about dukkha, right? Suffering, it's often translated as part of the human condition. And to know that Bill Miller, who's way smarter than me, went through this, that Jason Karp, who I write about, who's like this sort of brilliant, smart, charming, handsome guy who kind of, was clinically depressed while running this very successful and then unsuccessful hedge fund. Knowing that these guys go through difficult times, that's helpful in its own right. I think just knowing that it's part of the human condition is really helpful. And knowing that you need to focus on what you can control, and that you can control things like behaving honorably. You can control your inner state. That's really key. And then the other thing that struck me is you need to really focus on building equanimity. This isn't something where you just want to wait until things go wrong before you start to say, wow, I can't believe how little equanimity I have. I think it's really smart to think about where you're going to get your peace of mind, how you're going to build peace of mind, where you're going to get your strength during the inevitable periods of tumult in your life. And so one of the most obvious things that Guy Spears talked to me about is he said, well, in Guy's book, we talk a lot about things like how you structure your environment and where you put your Bloomberg terminal and things like that. And he's like, that's so obtuse and superficial in retrospect. He's like, it's much less important than my emotional environment. He's like, it's much more important for me to be getting on with my wife and kids and to have good friends. And so even the knowledge that you need good relationships to help you get through periods of tumult. So if you're just focused on your career and you're not at all focused on having a good marriage or a good relationship with your significant other or a good relationship with your kids, that's a vulnerability. I also think I write to some degree about meditation, which I think is an incredibly valuable habit. And I think it's not a surprise that so many of the great investors are serious meditators. And there's a really important observation that came from Ken Schubenstein, who I write about in the chapter about Charlie Munger, where Ken said to me, and Ken is an expert on the brain. He's someone who left the investment business and actually became a neurologist. So profoundly an expert on the brain as well as investing. And he said to me, you don't really want to wait till you're in the midst of a crisis to be adopting good habits that give you equity. He said, you actually want to do it before the crisis hits. And so he said to me, there are basically four things, if I remember rightly, that have a huge impact, that we know demonstrably, scientifically, have a huge impact on your cognitive performance, on how well you make decisions. And so he said, meditation helps, good nutrition helps, exercise helps. What's the fourth one? Sleep. Right? So we know those things scientifically have an enormous impact. So he said, during difficult periods, when he was getting knocked off course, including this period, he actually was treating patients in a COVID ward, and they're all, connected to ventilators and were dying. And he had a kid who had just been born. His first child had just been born. And he's staying in a hotel so that he wouldn't put his wife and kid at risk, so that he can be a doctor in the midst of this terrible pandemic. So he said during that period, he was trying to get back to basics, to eat well, to sleep properly. He said it wasn't really possible for him to meditate, so he would just go into the men's room in the emergency room, I guess, and would just try to have mindful moments where he breathed carefully for 10 seconds, 20 seconds. But I think that, and he continued to exercise. And these were things that he really did during the financial crisis as well, when he had a hellish time during the financial crisis, a hedge fund manager, that he learned, okay, I have to stop eating, vanilla ice cream with Oreos broken up. Yeah, which was, he told me how much he laughed when he actually read the book and he realized I'd sort of exposed the secret sin of his. Just the awareness that it's helpful to do these things before the crisis hits, I think is very important. And then Ken also told me another thing that I think is profoundly helpful, which is, he said, you need to understand when you're in these physiological states that are going to make you much more prone to make mistakes, whether you're a hedge fund manager or a doctor treating COVID patients. And so he said, for him, the mnemonic that was really helpful is HALT PS, which is hungry, angry, lonely, tired, in pain, stressed, or scared, sad, whatever you want the S to be. And so for Ken, he said repeatedly when he was working with patients in a COVID ward, he was saying, okay, so what's my state? Am I in one of these states? And he's like, yeah, my PPE equipment hurts. My mask actually physically hurts. And my back is hurting. He has a bad back from I guess a wrestling injury when he was a teen. And so just knowing that in those states, he has to slow down. He has to take extra care to be more compassionate, to be more patient, to be kinder, because he's in a state where he could screw up. That's a really valuable, practical tool. And I think there's something wonderful about the fact that he could take this lesson that he developed as a hedge fund manager and as a professor at Columbia Business School and apply it in. And he said it had been incredibly helpful, just that one tool in being a doctor. And so I don't know, it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think just understanding how your inner landscape, how your emotions are likely to torpedo your judgment, and that needs to become a central aspect of what you do. It's not a side issue. Exercising and meditating. Like I used to feel kind of guilty if I exercised and if I meditated, like I was sort of wasting my time sitting. And I used to feel, I still feel slightly guilty about it. And I think I used the fact that I was working too hard as an excuse not to exercise because I found it so tedious. And then at a certain point, I'm like, actually, this is kind of mission critical because I'm a 53-year-old man and I'm like a little overweight. My blood pressure was getting a little high. I'm like, if I don't take this seriously, you can see all the comorbidities with COVID make it much more dangerous. I'm like, I can't just be saying this is inconvenient to do this and I should focus on work. And so I think understanding how critical it is to build these habits like meditation, walking in nature, building resilient, strong, caring, loving relationships, exercise, eating properly. And I'm constantly falling off track, but to take Tom Gaynor's phrase, at least to try to be directionally correct is important.
Yeah. So it really sounds like, one, have the mindfulness tools to sort of do a self-diagnostic. Where am I at, and what are the potential stressors where I could be thrown off here and be making suboptimal decisions? And then, once again, everyone faces adversity at some point. And so anticipating that, you should be making the investments now in yourself to sort of build that resiliency, build that reservoir, so that way you're more likely to keep a level head, when
Yeah.
comes.
Yeah, and I think knowing that it's truly a priority. And it's funny, I invested a couple of years ago in a hedge fund run by Josh Tarasoff, who's a very smart, gifted hedge fund manager. And one of the reasons I invested, he has great returns, and he's a very, very smart guy. I really love the fact that he's a serious meditator. And I had lunch with him a couple of weeks ago, and I realized afterwards that we had basically talked about nothing except meditation. We'd never got around to talking about investing. We just talked about meditation and spiritual stuff. And I don't know, I was asking him about his mother and his father, and he was saying, yeah, my mother's just really chill. I thought it was a wonderful word to be able to use about your parents. She's got a great temperament. She's very calm. And I can see one of the things I like so much about Josh, and that makes him such a good investor, is he's really chill. And one of the reasons he's chill is because he meditates seriously. And so, yeah, I think that's really important to build in, to know that it's mission critical. And I met Yen Liao, another terrific hedge fund manager, a few weeks ago. We were having lunch, and again, we spent much of the time talking about meditation and similar matters. And you can see his mind is in good shape. He's got a degree of emotional equilibrium that I think is really important. And so there are certain people who find meditation really hard, or they haven't found the right sort of meditation for them. And and there are lots of different techniques. I'm not trying to be a proselytizer in any way, but I think understanding, there's a reason why Ray Dalio has been such a proponent of transcendental meditation. And so there are a lot of ways to slice this, but knowing that your emotional equilibrium is a key part of the process, I think is very valuable. Another thing I would say that's been very helpful to me, that I think is, again, might be somewhat delusional, but that I think is an incredibly powerful delusion, if it is one, is to have that sense that, to put it in kind of somewhat kind of goofy terms, that everything's from the light, just to which I think is something that Templeton truly believed. Like I remember saying, he made this extraordinary bet during World War II, where he bet on 104 stocks that were all priced under $1 each, and so they were the least desirable stocks, and something like 37 of them were in bankruptcy. And I said, and he ended up making 5 times his money. And I said to him, has it been a help to you that you've had your faith, your religious faith? And he said, oh, tremendously. He said, I always trusted that the world was getting better. I never got despondent. And this is from a guy whose first wife had died in a motorcycle accident, leaving him alone with 3 kids to raise. I mean, it's not like he'd been through nothing. And that, to me, there's this beautiful Hebrew phrase that I'll mispronounce, which is Gamsu Tova, which is basically, Tov is best, right? It is good. So it's basically like, this too is for the best. And there was a famous teacher of Rabbi Akiva, who was a very kind of elevated figure 2,000 years ago, and his teacher was called the Gamsu Ish, which is like, this too is the best, is for the best man, because whatever happened, he would just be like, this too is for the best. And maybe that's a delusion, but it's so helpful to say, and I'm kind of friends with Tony Robbins as well, and Tony will always say, not just to me, but to everyone, he says, life happens for you, not to you. And whether that's a delusion or not, It's an incredibly helpful attitude. So when you're struck with adversity, have this sense that it's happening for you and that you need to use it in some way. Someone said to me the other day that it's to help you grow, it's to purify you, maybe it's to correct something in your personality or in your past behavior, but that's a very useful mindset, because I think it gets you out of just being a victim and saying, oh, poor me, I can't believe this is happening to me. And then there's another beautiful line from Charlie Munger that I quote in the book, where he said, the idea of looking at life as a series of adversities that gives you an opportunity either to behave well or badly is a very, very good idea. And I think that's a slightly darker view than my one of no, this too is for the best, which may be too sunny and delusional for some people. Especially sort of, cynical skeptics like I would have been when I went to interview John Templeton all those years ago. But Templeton's filter of saying, okay, this adversity is an opportunity either to behave well or badly. So that's a very, very helpful filter.
Oh, love that. Listen, I want to respect your time, William. So I do have a lot more questions. I have one really that's pressing in my head, but I want to respect your time. So do I have time for one more question?
Yeah, I'm happy to keep going. It's one of the great challenges of life is to stop me talking. So
I'm loving this. So let me get this last one in, just because it's once again, Warren Buffett's one of my life heroes, and he said this, and it really sort of shook me. And it was in your book where you were talking about sleep and Zakaria, I think, where they had this monster run, just generating amazing returns. And then at that peak, managing several $billion, they could have leveraged that. But instead, as you talk, they said, you know what, now what's aligning with our own self, sort of saying, hey, we're going to actually get away from the game and consider more philanthropic causes. And they wrote to Buffett, and his response was, I predict you will find life is just beginning. And to hear that from Buffett sort of saying, I applaud you for getting out of the game. I mean, that just sort of really just surprised me it shook me, hearing for a guy that had committed his life. He had his own personal, challenges, at least based on the biographies of family and based on so committing to investing. So I'd love to hear if you have any sort of thoughts on the nuance there with sort of saying, hey, Warren Buffett effectively saying, you know what, maybe your happiness or what have you is better off doing that.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One of which may be a little more surprising, which is just think about the kindness of Buffett writing to these guys who he didn't know, who basically sent him a fan letter from London saying, we've owned Berkshire for a long time and it's done fantastically for our shareholders. Thank you. And now we're returning all this money and we're going to focus on our philanthropic foundations, and retired at the grand old age of 45 so they could give away much of the money that they'd earned. And so Buffett writes to these youngsters who he could get nothing out of, no benefit, takes the time to write to them a really thoughtful letter. And I saw this a few years ago where I helped Guy Spear with his annual report. I help edit it and talk to him about it. And it's partly just an excuse for me to actually sit down with Guy and talk about stuff that I enjoy talking about. And a few years ago, Warren sent Guy a note saying it was one of the best annual reports he'd read in a long time. And your shareholders must be very happy, with your communications and with your returns and stuff like that. And I remember talking to Guy about it. Guy was like blown away, and he was like, why would he do this? And I was just like, it's just kind. And he knows that his life is going to be happier if he behaves this way. And he knows that he's making your life better, that it doesn't take a huge amount of effort for him to do it. And it has such an outsized benefit for you. And I think there's something kind of revealing about that Buffett has set himself, I mean, Buffett's a master of saying no, right? Of refusing interviews, of refusing to do things. In a way, it reminds me of Bill Miller saying, someone invited him to give this keynote speech, and he's like, would I have to wear a tuxedo? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, I threw away my tuxedo. I'm never buying another one. And I love that sense of alignment with who he is. But Buffett, despite his ability to say no to the many calls on his time and attention, has this kindness where he's able to step in and write to people like Nick and Zach and Guy and just give them a pat on the head. And when they're behaving well, I think one of the things, if I look back, one of the things about Guy's annual report is Guy is incredibly honest about his mistakes. And so he spends the whole of the annual report basically saying, here's what I misunderstood, here's what I got wrong. And then, maybe there's one sentence about something that turned out brilliantly. And I think Warren sees that, and he's patting Guy on the head and he's saying, good boy, look how honestly and decently you're behaving. Yeah. And I think when he's seeing behavior in the world that he applauds, he's encouraging it. And so I don't think he's looking at Nick and Zach and saying, I can't believe you're getting out of the game that I love and that I know is mesmerizing. I think he's looking and he's like, these are pretty impressive guys who made all this money, and they're not so greedy that they're going to just keep maximizing their profits. They're just going to focus on trying to solve the puzzle of giving the money away. And I've talked to Charlie Munger about this, and Munger is hugely impressed with Nick and Zach as well. And I think he also was very struck by the fact that they were prepared to give up huge fees and just focus on something more important. And I talked to Nick Sleep recently, and he's still just owns 4 stocks basically. He's just so he's just doing the same thing. And when I spoke to Zach, he's like, every 6 months I check my portfolio and I think, what would Nick do? And I think he wouldn't do anything. And then I close it up, and then I get back to thinking about other stuff. And so I think part of what they thought is they'd cracked the problem of investing. They put together this incredible portfolio. They weren't going to change anything because they had owned a few companies that had great destinations. Yeah. And why would they charge people a huge amount to ride along with them in these companies with great destinations? And so, and I think they kind of wanted to spend more time with family, and so yeah, there's something immensely impressive about what Nick and Zach did, about their alignment with themselves and their desire to do something good with the money. Yeah. And I don't think they were never really in it for, as Nick said, for the cake. He said the cake was a reward. It was a sort of side issue, but we weren't in it for the cake. Yeah. They were in it to do it with the highest quality. And I think what's been striking to me is that in some ways that chapter has had the biggest impact on readers of all the chapters. And when I decided to go big on writing about Nick and Zach, it was quite a scary decision because they were the least well known. They were these 2 Londoners who'd never done interviews and had closed their fund and retired. And here I am, I'm going to write 11,000 words about these unknown investors who shut up shop and are now giving away the money. And I think if you read the books of someone like David Hawkins, I write about David Hawkins' book Power versus Force, which is a very, very interesting book, which had a formative influence on Monish Pabrai and Guy Spear and Arnold van der Boom to some degree. Partly it's all about being truthful. Hawkins talks about certain behavior kind of calibrates, to use his language, at a very high level, and certain virtues, certain behavior, whether it's compassion, kindness, honesty, sharing, basically calibrates at a very high level, whereas things like shame and guilt and jealousy and stuff, they just calibrate at a very low level. When I say that, there's actually a part of me that kind of like feels weaker. Yeah, exactly. And when you talk about compassion, sharing, kindness, mercy, love, things like that, it's like, oh, good, you feel a little better. Those things make you go strong in David Hawkins' terminology. And I suspect what's happening on a kind of subconscious level, if I'm being kind of somewhat mystical about this, is that writing about Nick and Zach makes people go strong because they embody this fixation on acting in a high quality way. They treat each other in a high quality way. They treat their shareholders. They treat, they're honorable.
Yeah.
And even you think about Nick writing to Buffett to thank him. You don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, for me, in a way, they're a good emblem of what I'm trying to do in the book, where I'm looking at people and thinking, what do I want to be more like?
Yeah.
And what works? And you're not hero worshiping. You're not lionizing these people and saying they're all flawless, and because they're not. We all have our moments where we get off course. But I think one of the most helpful things is to look at the people you admire in the book and say, okay, what that works. Let me be more like that. If that's the destination. And so a friend of mine was saying, you don't go to Charlie Munger to learn about etiquette. And to some degree, that's true. I write about Charlie Munger's willingness to say kind of brusque things to people. But actually, when I went to interview Charlie in Los Angeles, it was before the Daily Journal meeting, and it was a brief meeting. At the end of it, I was trying to ask him more questions as he walked, and he was like, I can't keep these people waiting. And there was something about it that was really kind and really respectful of their time. Like there's a deep sense of etiquette and decency and morality and concern for other people, as well as the willingness to say things that are rude and insulting and overly truthful. But I think you want to look at each of these characters and say, what can I learn from this person? And so from Charlie, like that extraordinary rationality, openness to other people's views. From Nick and Zach, that incredible commitment to quality, as it infuses everything, the way they treat each other, the way they treat others, the way they treat their shareholders. So I think you can, or you look at Monish and his obsession with being truthful, or his determination, even though he believes life is meaningless and it's all just a game. He's turning his extraordinary ability to find mispriced gambles into something that actually is lifting thousands and thousands of gifted kids out of poverty in India. It's an incredible thing. And so you look at each of these people and you're like, okay, let me be a bit more like that. And so in some ways, what I was trying to do was to show that there's an enlightened way to do capitalism. And capitalism has a bad name, and to some degree, really justifiably. And I think these people point you towards a better way to do it, a little more honorable, more high quality. And so I think, to go back to your original question about Buffett, I think Buffett sees behavior that he likes, and he applauds it and encourages it. And I think it's also in some ways a recognition of the fact that these small acts of kindness on his part, like writing a letter to Nick and Zach or to Guy Spear, have an outsized impact on them. And so it's using his capital, the capital of time, in a very interesting way to make other people happier. And so if you're reverse engineering people's lives, the lives of great investors, and you say, why is it that Buffett tap dances to work each day? Well, but it's because he's surrounded by good people, because he treats them well.
Yeah.
He treats them decently, and also he's doing something that he's great at and that he loves. But the relationships are key. Yeah. And so I think that kind of behavior has brought better relationships to him, which also means he gets a better information flow, which also means he gets to partner with better people because they want to sell their companies to him. And so none of it is separate. The way that you end up behaving in private, when you send a letter to Guy, or you send a letter to Nick, which I happen to know about, I've seen those things, but most people aren't seeing them. That behavior, there are these ripples, and you see it infusing the lives of these investors. And I think that was one of the things that was most interesting to me, was to see that there's a real consistent thread between the way people behave privately, the way they exercise, the way they meditate, all of these things, and the way they invest. It's all connected.
Wow. That was thank you so much, William. This has been phenomenal. I think that last answer really touched on one of the key aspects to that happiness, is that finding something that's just beyond yourself and doubling down on that in terms of lifting other people up, whether or not it's Monish Bagrai's, Dakshina, or Templeton super tithing, or here it is, Nick Sleep and Zakaria going, effectively saying at the height of their career, saying, hey, now it's back to philanthropy. So I just think,
yeah,
phenomenal. So thank you so much for sharing
thank you.
your time. This is fantastic. I hope all the YouTube community that's watching this can seriously benefit the way I have from watching this. So thank you once again, William.
Thank you. It's such a treat.